Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So think about this situation for a second. You invite 80 of your biggest political rivals to a massive feast.
Right, and it's billed as this grand reconciliation.
Exactly. It's supposed to be a chance to, bury the hatchet and move forward together. The guests arrive, they sit down to eat, and before the main course is even finished, your armed guards seal the doors and just slaughter every single one of them.
Which is brutal enough, but then...
Yeah, then just to make absolutely sure no one can ever identify the bodies and, claim their lineage, you have horses brought right into the dining hall to trample the remains into the floor. Today, we're undertaking a comprehensive deep dive into the Abbasid Caliphate. We're looking at a vast empire that stretched all the way from North Africa to Central Asia, ruling from 750 to 1258.
It's really just a massive expanse of time, geography, and political evolution. We're looking at a dynasty that fundamentally reshaped the medieval world. And to understand the heights this empire reached, we kind of have to look at the foundation they laid.
Right, and as that dinner party illustrates, that foundation was inherently violent.
It was. We have to examine the highly calculated way the Abbasids seized power from the preceding Umayyad Caliphate.
So the mission for this deep dive is to explore the sources and understand exactly how they managed to overthrow an existing, deeply entrenched empire, how they built this globally connected administrative and intellectual powerhouse from scratch, and then ultimately how that system fragmented and fell to external cataclysm.
It's a really complex case study in empire building, into intellectual synthesis, and then, systemic collapse.
But let's start with that transition of power, because by the 740s, the Umayyad Caliphate was essentially a hollowed-out structure.
Yeah, they were suffering from severe succession crises.
Right, you had rebellions tearing through their territories, the center was weak, and that weakness just created this massive vacuum.
And to fully grasp why the Umayyads were so vulnerable, we need to look at the specific pressures they were facing. I mean, the Umayyads ruled from Damascus, and their power structure was very much an exclusive Arab aristocracy.
So it was a pretty tight inner circle.
Exactly. But by the mid-8th century, that system was really buckling. For one, you had the Kharijite rebellions.
Let's unpack the Kharijites for a moment, because they're pretty crucial to understanding this instability. Based on the sources, who are the Kharijites, and why were they such a thorn in the side of the Umayyads?
Well, the Kharijites were a radically puritanical sect. They emerged during the very first Islamic civil wars, and their core belief was that leadership of the Muslim community shouldn't be based on bloodline or tribal affiliation at all.
So, no dynasties.
None. They believed leadership should belong to the most pious Muslim, period. Even if that person was an enslaved Abyssinian, they rejected the concept of a dynastic caliphate entirely.
I see. And because the Umayyads had established this strict hereditary dynasty, the Kharijites viewed them as fundamentally illegitimate.
Illegitimate and deeply corrupt. This meant the Kharijites were in a state of, near constant fervent rebellion. They were fighting this asymmetric insurgency that constantly bled the Umayyad military of resources, manpower, and morale.
So the Umayyad military is just exhausted trying to put out these ideological fires, and that weakness was felt most deeply in the easternmost province of the empire, Khorasan, which is in modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia.
Right, the frontier.
Yeah, this is where a heavily motivated coalition of discontent really began to form. You have these disparate groups who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have much to do with one another, suddenly finding common ground.
Because they shared a deep resentment of Umayyad rule. Khorasan was heavily militarized, highly diverse, and far away from the central authority in Damascus.
So it's basically the perfect incubator for a revolution.
Exactly. And you can break down the grievances of this coalition into 3 distinct factions.
Let's look at who made up that coalition. First, you have Shia Muslims. To understand their motivation, the sources say we have to go back to the year 680, to the Battle of Karbala.
Right, a pivotal moment.
The Shia community was still deeply grieving and angry over the massacre of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, at the hands of an Umayyad army. This wasn't just a political defeat, right?
No, it was a profound, lingering theological and cultural wound. For the Shia, the Umayyads were literally the murderers of the Prophet's family.
Which provides immense moral and emotional outrage for the revolution. Then you had the non-Arab Muslim converts who were known as the Mawali.
Right, because the Umayyad system was, as we noted, an Arab-centric aristocracy. The Mawali, who were largely Persian converts to Islam, were totally marginalized.
even though the foundational principles of the religion say all Muslims are supposed to be equal.
Exactly. But under the Umayyads, the Mawalis were treated as second-class citizens. They were structurally locked out of the highest levels of government, denied equal shares of the spoils of war, and, in many cases, forced to continue paying taxes that were supposedly only meant for non-Muslims.
You can just imagine being a Persian convert in Khorasan. You're fighting in the empire's armies, you're contributing to the economy, you share the faith, but the state still taxes you heavily and treats you as inferior purely because you don't have the right Arab tribal lineage.
The resentment must have been suffocating.
Definitely. And adding to this volatility, the third faction was actually long-settled Khorasani Arabs.
Yeah, these were Arab tribes that had moved east generations prior. They'd intermarried with the local populations, adopted local customs, and just felt completely alienated by the distant, haughty Umayyad capital in Damascus.
They felt they were out there doing the hard work on the frontier while the elite in Syria reaped all the rewards.
It was a highly combustible social dynamic.
Yeah.
You have religious outrage, economic disenfranchisement, and regional alienation all converging in one province.
And this is where we see an enigmatic figure named Abu Muslim enter the picture. In 747, he raises the black banner of rebellion in the city of Merv.
And his real genius isn't necessarily military, it's political. He manages to organize this incredibly diverse, fragile coalition into a functional, unified force.
Because he was a brilliant organizer, right? He understood that to keep this coalition together, they needed a unifying ideology.
But one that was powerful enough to motivate people, yet vague enough not to alienate anyone before the war was won. The Abbasids themselves provided that ideological glue.
They claimed legitimacy through their descent from Al-Abbas, who was an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, but they were very careful with their messaging, weren't they? They didn't explicitly say, we, the Abbasid family, are going to take over.
Exactly. They used incredibly vague slogans. They simply called for leadership to be returned to the family of the Prophet, the Al-Bayt.
Oh, I see.
By keeping it deliberately vague, they allowed the Shia factions to believe the movement was fighting to install an Ali leader, a direct descendant of Ali and Fatima.
And they allowed the Mawali to believe they were fighting for a universalist, egalitarian Islamic state.
Right. It was a calculated, programmatic ambiguity designed to unite all these disparate groups under one black banner without committing to a specific post-revolution power structure.
And that strategic ambiguity really pays off. The revolution sweeps westward out of Khorasan. This culminates in the Battle of the Zab in January 750 in modern-day Iraq.
A massive clash.
Yeah, you have roughly 100,000 Abbasid troops meeting 120,000 Umayyad troops.
The Umayyads had a slight numerical advantage, sure, but they severely lacked cohesion and morale. The Abbasid coalition troops from Khorasan were hardened veterans. Furthermore, the physical conditions of the battle played a huge role. It was a harsh winter.
The Umayyad army completely collapses under the pressure. The records describe just sheer panic. As the Abbasids push forward, the Umayyad soldiers attempt to retreat across a pontoon bridge over the Zab River, but the bridge gives way.
And thousands drown in the freezing water.
Right. Caliph Marwan II is forced to flee. He runs from Iraq to Syria, then all the way to Egypt, where he is eventually hunted down and killed in a village on the Nile.
With Marwan's death, the Umayyad state effectively ceases to exist. But winning the war is only half the battle.
Securing the peace and cementing a new dynasty requires an entirely different set of actions, which brings us back to that horrific dinner party I mentioned at the start.
The banquet of blood.
Yes. Once the Abbasids win, they don't just take the throne, they execute a systemic geographical eradication of the previous regime. The first Abbasid Caliph takes the throne name Al-Safa, which translates to the bloodshedder.
He definitely earned the title.
He invites 80 to 90 surviving Umayyad princes to a banquet under the guise of reconciliation. It's framed as a peace offering. Instead, his guards slaughter every single one of them, and then they have horses trample the bodies.
The scale of the violence is staggering. Only one significant figure, Abd al-Rahman I, manages to escape, fleeing across North Africa to eventually found a new Umayyad dynasty in Al-Andalus in modern Spain.
It's a brutal execution of power, but I have to push back on this a bit. How do you reconcile the stark contrast here? The Abbasids spent years broadcasting this pious, religiously driven propaganda. They claimed rightful moral leadership over the corrupt Umayyads.
Right.
And their very first act in power is the sheer calculated ruthlessness of inviting 80 people to dinner just to massacre them and crush their bones. How is that justified within their own narrative?
It is a really sharp contradiction.
Mm.
But the answer lies in the functional reality of their situation. We have to shift the focus away from their religious rhetoric and look at the actual demands of medieval state building.
So dynastic elimination was a functional requirement.
Precisely. It was a causal requirement to stabilize a post-revolutionary state. If even a handful of legitimate Umayyad claimants survived in the core territories of Syria or Iraq, they would inevitably become magnets for lingering tribal loyalties and disaffected factions.
Because the Umayyads had ruled for nearly a century.
Exactly. They had deep roots, vast networks of patronage, allied tribes. By executing the entire royal house in one stroke, Al-Safa brutally severed those old tribal ties.
He forced the empire to orient itself around an entirely new, centralized authority.
He was exceedingly violent, but politically it functioned as a definitive reset button, basically preventing decades of subsequent civil war.
So, having completely wiped the Umayyad dynasty off the board, the Abbasids now needed a new center of gravity. Damascus was tainted.
Yeah, it was the old Umayyad stronghold. The population was likely hostile, and geographically it was too close to the Byzantine frontier.
They needed to move east, closer to their Persian power base in Khorasan, to build a capital that could actually manage this sprawling empire.
This is where we see the transition from violent revolution to systematic, visionary state building. In 762, the second caliph, al-Mansur, undertakes one of the most ambitious urban planning projects in history. He decides to build a new capital from scratch.
And he founds Baghdad. Originally, it was called Madinat as-Salam, the City of Peace. The scale of this project is just difficult to wrap your head around. The sources note it required over 100,000 workers, architects, engineers, and craftsmen drawn from all over the empire just to construct it.
And the design itself was highly intentional and heavily symbolic. Baghdad was famously designed as a perfect circle, the round city.
Which wasn't just an aesthetic choice.
No, it drew heavily on ancient Sasanian Persian concepts of bill space. The circular design communicated absolute centralized power. The Caliph's palace and the Grand Mosque were situated at the exact geometric center of the city, literally radiating authority outward.
But it was also a formidable fortress. They had a massive, wide, circular ditch along the outer walls, crenellated battlements, and then there's this deeply pragmatic architectural detail.
Of the bent gate entrances.
The 4 massive gates of the city were angled at 45 degrees to the cardinal points, pointing towards Khorasan, Basra, Kufa, and Syria. But it's the internal design of the gates that is so strategically significant. Let's unpack the mechanics of these bent gates, because it's a brilliant piece of defensive engineering. The design literally forced anyone entering the gate to make a sharp left turn within the gatehouse itself.
Right.
If you're an invading force rushing the gate, consider the logistics of hand-to-hand combat. Most soldiers are right-handed. They hold their sword or spear in their right hand and their heavy wooden or leather shield in their left arm.
So when the architecture of the corridor forces you to turn left,
You are suddenly exposing your right side, your unshielded side, directly to the guards stationed in the alcoves and towers above.
it's a highly astute defensive feature. This kind of bent entrance design was actually quite uncommon in early Muslim cities, or even in earlier Byzantine traditions.
It created an immediate choke point.
Exactly. It gave the defenders a critical window of time to assail any intruders who had hostile intent by exploiting their physical vulnerability. It shows how deeply al-Mansur was thinking about security.
And beyond the defenses and the symbolism, the geographic location was a masterstroke of economic planning. Situated right on the Tigris River and close to the Euphrates, Baghdad became a global node.
It seamlessly linked the overland Silk Road routes stretching all the way from Tang Dynasty China with the maritime routes that connected the Persian Gulf to India and East Africa.
It just became this massive funnel for global wealth.
And, well, to manage that massive influx of wealth and govern such a vast geographically diverse territory, the Abbasids quickly realized that the old Arab tribal systems of administration were entirely insufficient.
You can't run a global empire using the informal patronage networks of desert tribes.
No, you need a robust, highly structured bureaucracy. So they leaned heavily into their Persian support base and adopted Sasanian administrative models, centralizing power under a newly powerful office, the vizier.
Who functioned essentially as a prime minister. Early on, this role was utterly dominated by a prominent Persian family, the Barmakids. You have figures like Khalid ibn Barmak and his son, Yahya ibn Khalid, effectively running the entire day-to-day machinery of the empire, while the caliph handled the broader strategic and religious leadership.
And that administrative machinery was organized into highly specialized departments, known as the Diwan system.
I find it helpful to think of the Abbasid administrative structure almost like a massive, modern, multinational corporation.
Oh, that's a very apt comparison.
You have the caliph sitting at the top as the chairman of the board. The vizier is the CEO, executing the strategic vision and handling the day-to-day executive decisions. And the diwans are the highly specialized corporate departments that are essential for scaling operations on a global level.
The level of specialization was really unprecedented for the region at that time.
You had the Diwan al-Kharaj, which is your finance and revenue department, the Diwan al-Jund, functioning as the military and defense logistics branch, managing troop rosters and pay. Then there's the Diwan al-Rasail, the chancellery, which handled all official correspondence, drafted treaties, and managed state messaging. The Diwan al-Barid, which was a combination of a rapid postal service and an internal intelligence agency, keeping the caliph informed of what provincial governors were doing.
A very necessary tool for an emperor.
Absolutely. And finally, the Diwan al-Qad, the Department of Justice, headed by the chief Qadoi, managing the legal system.
And of all those departments, the Diwan al-Kharaj, the finance department, was the absolute engine that kept the entire corporation running.
The money has to flow.
Always. The Abbasids relied heavily on adopting these Sasanian bureaucratic traditions for one very specific reason. It was the only proven way to effectively extract taxes on a massive scale.
Specifically the Kharaj, the land tax.
Exactly. The empire's wealth was fundamentally based on an agrarian economy. The trade routes brought in luxury goods and tariffs, sure, but the real bedrock of the treasury was the hyper-fertile Sawad region in southern Iraq, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
And managing that requires serious expertise.
Right, maintaining the intricate irrigation canals, accurately assessing crop yields, and collecting the land tax required a literate, numerate, and highly organized class of bureaucrats. You needed people who understood geometry to survey the land and accounting to track the revenue.
Without that Persian-style administration, they could never have funded the armies or the grand architectural projects in Baghdad. The agricultural tax revenue from the Sawad basically funded the entire imperial project.
Which brings us to a crucial point. What did they actually do with all that wealth?
The immense tax revenues and the trade funneling through Baghdad didn't just go into building palaces or paying soldiers. It funded an unprecedented intellectual movement.
The bureaucracy itself created a heavy demand for knowledge. To run a complex tax system, you need mathematicians and accountants. To run the legal system, you need scholars of jurisprudence. To maintain the health of the elite, you need physicians.
So this intensely practical need for educated administrators fueled a broader cultural renaissance. We see this reach its cultural zenith under two major caliphs, Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, and his son al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833.
And the crown jewel of this era is the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah.
Originally, under Harun al-Rashid, it began primarily as a translation bureau and a royal library to house Persian texts. But under al-Mamun, it really expanded into a massive, vibrant academic center.
The Abbasids actively commissioned scholars to track down and translate texts from Greek, Persian, Syriac, and Indian sources into Arabic. They were literally sending emissaries to the Byzantine Empire just to request copies of ancient Greek manuscripts.
They were preserving the works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy. But it's vital to understand this wasn't just a giant copying exercise.
No, not at all.
They weren't just putting Greek words into Arabic script and filing them away. It was a dynamic process of synthesis and expansion.
Exactly. The translators were also scholars in their own right. They would take Greek geometry, combine it with Indian numeral systems, what we now call Hindu-Arabic numerals, including the concept of zero, and push the boundaries of mathematics forward.
A perfect example is the polymath al-Khwarizmi. He utilized this synthesized knowledge to write a foundational text on solving linear and quadratic equations. The Arabic term he used in the title of his book for completion or rejoining was algebra, which is where we get the word algebra.
You also have figures like the Sabian astronomer and mathematician Thabit ibn Qurra, who translated Greek texts but also made original discoveries in mechanics and geometry, and the famed translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Syriac Christian who standardized Arabic medical and scientific terminology.
We also have to discuss a pivotal geopolitical event that acted as an accelerant for this entire intellectual boom. the Battle of Talis in 751.
Right, that's a fascinating clash of empires. You have Abbasid forces marching east and clashing with the Tang Chinese army in Central Asia.
Near the borders of modern-day Kyrgyzstan.
The Abbasids won the battle, halting Chinese expansion into Central Asia. But far more important than the territorial victory was who they captured. They took Chinese prisoners of war who knew the closely guarded secret of papermaking.
The introduction of paper technology to the Islamic world was an absolute game changer. Before this, texts had to be written on papyrus, which was fragile and mostly imported from Egypt, or parchment, which is made from animal skins.
And parchment is incredibly durable, but it is vastly expensive and thick. You need a whole flock of sheep just to make one substantial book.
Paper, made from linen rags and hemp, was dramatically cheaper to produce. It held ink beautifully, it was harder to forge documents on without leaving traces of erasure, and it was lightweight.
It made books affordable to a much wider segment of society. It vastly accelerated the dissemination of all the knowledge being translated and produced at the House of Wisdom. You start seeing massive markets for booksellers popping up in Baghdad.
It sounds like a remarkable period of open inquiry and enlightenment, but here is where we have to unpack a very serious, very dark historical contradiction.
Yes, the Mina.
Right. This exact same era, famously characterized by the translation movement, scientific advancement, and philosophical rationalism, also featured a rigid, oppressive state inquisition.
The Mina is really one of the most complex episodes in Abbasid history.
Caliph al-Ma'mun heavily favored a theological school known as Mutazilite rationalism. The Mutazilites applied Greek logic and rationalist principles to Islamic theology.
And one of their core tenets was the specific theological belief that the Quran was created by God in time, rather than being co-eternal with God.
And to enforce this highly specific rationalist view, al-Ma'mun utilized a state inquisition. Traditionalist scholars, most notably Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who believed the Quran was uncreated, were severely persecuted. They were interrogated, imprisoned, and in some cases tortured for resisting this state-sponsored theology.
It feels incredibly contradictory.
Yeah, how do you have a society that builds the House of Wisdom on one hand and then tortures scholars for their religious interpretations on the other?
It seems contradictory if we view it purely as a high-minded theological debate about the nature of the Quran. But we have to look at the underlying mechanics of power. The Mina was not just about theology, it was fundamentally a political tool.
Explain that.
Well, the translation movement and the rise of this massive, educated bureaucratic class meant that religious scholars, the ulama, were gaining significant independent social authority. They were becoming the arbiters of law, social norms, and morality, completely outside the direct control of the caliph.
So, as the society became more educated and complex, the caliph realized he was losing his monopoly on truth. The people were looking to the scholars for guidance, not the throne.
Exactly. By forcing these traditionalist scholars to publicly agree with the state-mandated Mutazilite doctrine, al-Ma'mun was asserting that the caliph, and only the caliph, held the ultimate authority to define religious orthodoxy.
Controlling theology was about centralizing his political authority over a rising, fiercely independent scholarly class.
It was a brutal reminder of who actually ran the empire. The torture of Ahmad ibn Hanbal wasn't just about forcing him to change his mind on a philosophical point. It was about breaking a powerful independent voice and demonstrating state supremacy.
That dynamic really highlights the tension at the heart of the empire. That intellectual and administrative elite sitting in Baghdad was governing a highly complex, multi-ethnic, and heavily stratified society. Managing these incredibly diverse populations was a constant, precarious balancing act.
The Abbasid Empire was a vast mosaic of Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Turks, Kurds, and various religious groups. And within the Muslim population itself, there were deep, lingering ethnic tensions, particularly regarding the status of Arabs versus non-Arabs.
We see this clearly with the rise of the Shubiya movement. This was a literary and cultural movement primarily among non-Arab Muslims, mostly Persians, who were pushing back against the idea of Arab cultural dominance.
Right. Now that they were running the bureaucracy and heavily involved in the intellectual elite, they used literature, poetry, and courtly etiquette to assert their cultural parity and sometimes even their superiority over the Arabs.
The proponents of the Shubiya would write blistering poetry, highlighting their ancient Sasanian heritage, their complex traditions of statecraft, and their deep philosophical roots, while sometimes deliberately mocking the Arabs as uncultured desert nomads who only recently learned how to govern.
It was a profound cultural friction playing out on the courts and salons of Baghdad.
You also see strict social stratifications in family and gender dynamics. The society was strictly patriarchal. Elite men practiced polygyny and maintained large harems of concubines known as jawari.
And the dynamics within those harems were intricate and highly political.
The records point out an interesting dynamic regarding these jawaris. These concubines were often highly educated. They were trained in music, poetry, singing, and sometimes even administration and history to make them entertaining companions for the elite.
Because of their proximity to the caliphs and high officials, and because they were often the mothers of future caliphs, some of these women wielded significant political influence behind the scenes.
Right, shaping court intrigue, patronage networks, and royal successions.
It is a complex paradox. You have these enslaved women exerting immense informal power at the highest levels of government, while at the exact same time, the broader public visibility of free women declined significantly during this period.
This was largely due to rising Persianate cultural influences that heavily favored strict physical seclusion and veiling for elite women, separating them from the public sphere in a way that wasn't as prevalent during the earlier, more tribal periods of Islam.
Then we have to look at the non-Muslim populations, the dhimmis. Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians were allowed to maintain their religious autonomy, their own courts for internal matters, and received state protection.
But in exchange, they had to pay the jizya, a specific poll tax levied on non-Muslim men.
The treatment of dhimmis is a fascinating study in the tension between religious ideology and the pragmatic necessities of running an empire. The policies and the daily reality for these groups fluctuated wildly depending on the economic needs of the state and the immediate political pressures bearing down on the caliph.
On one hand, you have long periods where they are heavily integrated into the highest levels of the bureaucracy and the economy. The texts note that Syriac Christians utterly dominated fiscal and accounting roles for a long time.
They had the institutional memory of Roman and Persian tax systems.
You also had Jewish bankers who were heavily involved in financing state ventures.
And the banking system they developed was incredibly sophisticated. They used early forms of checks and letters of credit called suftaja,
which allowed a merchant to deposit money in Baghdad and cash a letter of credit in Egypt, avoiding the danger of carrying physical gold across the desert.
Jewish financiers were essential to making this system work across the vast distances of the empire.
But then you have periods of strict Orthodox revival where the state cracks down hard. Caliph al-Mutawakkil, who ruled in the mid-9th century, is the prime example of this.
Yeah, al-Mutawakkil reversed the rationalist policies of the Mina and aligned himself heavily with the traditionalist Sunni clerics.
He enforced incredibly oppressive, humiliating edicts against the dhimmis. He mandated that Christians and Jews wear specific identifying colors, yellow or blue patches on their clothing.
He forced them to use wooden saddles on donkeys to distinguish them from Muslims riding horses.
He prohibited them from holding certain public offices, and he ordered the destruction of any newly built churches or synagogues. It really begs the question, how did a society that absolutely required non-Muslim expertise to run its complex financial and administrative systems simultaneously justify enforcing such humiliating, restrictive codes on those exact same people?
To understand this, we have to delineate between pragmatic governance and political theater. The pragmatic reality was that the Abbasid bureaucracy would grind to a halt without the literacy, linguistic skills, and financial acumen of Syriac accountants and Jewish administrators.
They needed them in the Diwan al-Kharaj to balance the books and collect the taxes.
But political survival often required theater. During times of social unrest, economic strain, or when the caliph felt his legitimacy waning, rulers like al-Mutawakkil needed to shore up their support among conservative, orthodox factions in the capital.
Issuing harsh, highly visible discriminatory laws against dhimmis was a low-cost way to project piety, assert Islamic supremacy, and appease those angry factions.
However, the enforcement of these laws was often sporadic. The caliph would issue a decree mandating that no Christian could hold a government post, the public would applaud, and then the decree would quietly be ignored when it came to the essential bureaucrats actually balancing the state's ledgers.
Because the state simply couldn't function without them.
Precisely.
It is classic scapegoating as statecraft. You use a minority population as a pressure valve for political tension. And speaking of the economy, we have to look at the darkest foundation of their wealth: mass slave labor. We talked about the wealth of the Sawad region, the agricultural engine of southern Iraq.
That engine relied heavily on enslaved people, notably East African slaves referred to as the Zanj.
The conditions in the southern marshes around Basra were horrific.
Yeah.
The Abbasids were trying to reclaim vast tracts of highly saline swampland to prepare it for lucrative cash crops like sugarcane.
To do this, they imported thousands of Zong slaves and forced them into grueling manual labor, scraping away the thick crust of nitrous salt from the topsoil in malaria-ridden heat.
You push a population that hard in conditions that brutal, and a fracture is inevitable. This leads directly to the Zanj Rebellion, lasting from 869 to 883.
This was not a minor, localized uprising.
No, it was a catastrophic, highly organized rebellion involving tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. They built their own cities, they minted their own coins, and they sacked major Abbasid cities like Basra, massacring the inhabitants.
The economic devastation to the heartland of the empire was absolute. It took the Abbasid military, led by the caliph's brother, 14 years of grueling swamp warfare, and over 2 million dinars to finally suppress the revolt.
It deeply wounded the agricultural output of their core territories and severely depleted the treasury.
And this internal instability, the massive Zanj rebellion in the south, the persistent factionalism and infighting among the Arab tribes, the constant civil wars over succession, like the devastating Fourth Fitna between Harun al-Rashid's sons.
All of this proved a terrifying point to the caliphs. Their traditional military structures were fundamentally broken.
They realized they could no longer rely on Arab tribal levies. The tribal soldiers were too enmeshed in local society. They had families, businesses, and divided loyalties based on tribal politics and religious factions.
If the caliph ordered them to put down a riot in Baghdad, they might refuse if they sympathized with the rioters.
The caliphs needed a force that was detached from society, loyal only to the throne.
So if you are Caliph al-Mu'tasim in the early 9th century, you have a massive treasury from tax revenues, but zero trustworthy local soldiers to protect you from your own populace. What do?
You go shopping for an entirely new kind of army.
This brings about a monumental shift in policy. He decides to completely restructure the military. He begins sidelining the traditional Arab armies and systematically purchasing Turkic nomads from the Central Asian steppes.
He creates an elite slave soldier corps, known as the Mamluks or Gilman. The mechanics of this system are crucial to understand. These were young boys purchased as slaves from the nomadic tribes of the steppe.
They were physically severed from their families and homelands, brought into the heart of the empire, converted to Islam, and given rigorous, highly disciplined military training.
The records highlight their training in Furusiyya, which was a comprehensive martial art focused on advanced cavalry tactics, lance fighting, and most importantly, mounted archery.
Because these young men had no local ties in Iraq, no local families to protect, and no tribal affiliations, their entire social status, their wealth, and their very lives derived directly from the patronage of the caliph.
In theory, it is the perfect autocratic tool, an elite, highly lethal striking force whose loyalty is entirely dependent on the ruler.
And in the short term, this professionalized army was incredibly effective. They achieved major victories. The most notable is the massive campaign in 838. Caliph al-Mu'tasim led this new Turkic army on a deep raid into Byzantine territory and completely sacked the major stronghold of Amorium.
It was a massive propaganda victory and proved the sheer military efficacy of the Mamluk system.
However, the long-term consequences of this system were disastrous for civic stability.
Introducing thousands of heavily armed, culturally distinct foreign soldiers who spoke a different language into the crowded heart of Baghdad immediately caused massive friction with the local civilian populace.
The Turkic soldiers were known for riding recklessly through the markets, leading to altercations, brawls, and eventually violent clashes in the streets.
The situation got so bad and the civilians were so enraged that in 836, al-Mu'tasim makes a drastic decision.
He actually moves the entire capital. He leaves Baghdad, the city his predecessor built specifically to be the center of the world, and builds a sprawling, heavily fortified military city called Samarra further up the Tigris River.
It is a stunning admission of political failure.
It's like a modern government deciding to replace its citizen military with a massive, heavily armed private mercenary corporation, and then realizing the mercenaries are so volatile and the citizens hate them so much that the government has to pack up and move the national capital to a military base 100 miles away just to keep the army away from the angry civilians.
That analogy perfectly captures the absurdity and the acute danger of the situation. The fatal flaw in al-Mu'tasim's system was isolation.
By moving to Samarra, he physically severed the military and the court from the society they were supposed to protect and govern.
He insulated the caliphate with a highly specialized, foreign warrior class. And it did not take long for these Turkic generals to look around and realize a very simple truth.
That if the caliph's power rests entirely on their swords, then they, not the caliph, hold all the actual physical power.
Right, they became a king-making class. And that realization backfired spectacularly, initiating a slow, agonizing process of political fragmentation. The military designed to protect the throne becomes its biggest threat.
This brings us to a dark chapter known as the Anarchy at Samarra, lasting from 861 to 870. The very system designed to protect the caliph ends up destroying him.
It starts when Turkic generals assassinate Caliph el-Mutawakkil in his own palace. And over the next decade, these rival military factions just install, depose, blind, and murder caliphs at will.
They treat the highest office in the Islamic world, the theoretical successor to the prophet, as a political football to be passed around or discarded whenever a general wants a bigger salary.
And while the military is busy playing kingmaker in Samarra and fighting internal civil wars, the economic foundation of the empire is eroding.
To pay this massive, demanding standing army, the state increasingly relied on an administrative system called the ikta. Let's break down the ikta system because it is the hidden economic poison that slowly kills the empire.
These were essentially land tax grants. Instead of paying a general his salary in cash directly from the central treasury in Baghdad, the state would grant him an ikka the right to go collect the agricultural taxes from a specific region, say a province in Persia, to fund his troops.
Initially, it was meant to be a temporary administrative tool to ease the burden on the central treasury. The general collects the tax, takes what he is owed to pay his men, and remits the surplus back to Baghdad.
But over time, as central authority weakened during the anarchy at Samarra, these generals entrenched themselves in their assigned provinces.
It's like if you hired a gardener to maintain your estate, and instead of paying him a salary, you gave him the right to collect rent from the tenants living in the guest house. At first, he collects the rent, takes his fee, and gives you the rest.
But eventually you get weak, and the gardener realizes he has all the tools and the keys, so he just keeps all the rent.
He passes the right to collect that rent down to his son. The ikwa grants became, essentially, hereditary fiefdoms. The generals collected the taxes, kept all the money to fund their private regional armies, and stopped sending any revenue back to the central treasury in Baghdad.
The numbers in the historical records are devastating. As this system proliferated, it ended up draining central revenues by up to 80%. The caliph literally could not afford to govern.
The central bureaucracy we discussed earlier, the Diwan al-Kharaj, withered away because there was no kharaj, no land tax coming in.
Deprived of funds and administrative authority, the edges of the empire simply broke away. Provincial governors realized Baghdad could no longer project military power or enforce tax collection, so they became independent local dynasties in all but name.
They still paid lip service to the caliph during Friday prayers, but they ruled autonomously. You see the rise of the Tahirids and the Samanids in the east, carving out their own territories in Persia and Central Asia.
You have the Tulunids taking absolute control of the wealth of Egypt. The map of a unified Abbasid empire just shatters into regional warlord states.
The humiliation of the Central Caliphate reaches a tipping point in 945. A Persian Shia militant group called the Umayyads marches right into Baghdad and assumes total administrative and military control.
They leave the Abbasid Caliph on the throne, but purely as a captive religious figurehead. He has no temporal power whatsoever.
He's essentially a prisoner in his own palace, forced to sign documents validating the rule of the Umayyad emirs.
And a century later, in 1055, the Umayyads are displaced by the Sunni Seljuk Turks, sweeping in from the east. But the situation for the caliph doesn't improve.
The Seljuks also keep the Abbasid Caliph as a convenient puppet to legitimize their own rule over the Sunni majority. The Abbasids spend centuries sitting in Baghdad, stripped of their armies, watching other dynasties rule their empire.
Which leaves the entire region fragmented, decentralized, and completely vulnerable to the greatest existential threat of the medieval era. We have to fast forward to the 13th century.
The Mongols. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, arrives outside the walls of Baghdad.
He brings an army estimated at 150,000 men, equipped with Chinese siege engineers and heavy artillery.
Against this overwhelming force, Caliph al-Mustasim has perhaps 50,000 poorly equipped troops. The situation is dire.
Yet, al-Mustasim stubbornly and arrogantly refuses to surrender or negotiate effectively. He genuinely believes that the broader Muslim world will rise up and march to defend the capital of the caliphate.
They do not. The fragmented regional dynasties are too weak or too intimidated to help. The Mongol siege engineers breached the city walls in a matter of days.
The resulting sack of Baghdad is apocalyptic. It is one of the most devastating events in medieval history. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are massacred.
The Mongols specifically target the cultural institutions. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and expanded the knowledge of antiquity for 500 years, is utterly destroyed. Its massive library is thrown into the river.
The records describe the Tigris River running black with the ink of millions of ruined books and then running red with the blood of the scholars and citizens.
It is widely considered the definitive, catastrophic end of the Islamic Golden Age. The intellectual heart of the empire was ripped out.
And the death of the caliph himself is a grim historical vignette. The Mongols had a specific cultural taboo against spilling royal blood directly onto the earth, believing it would anger the sky god.
So, to execute Caliph al-Mustasim without violating this taboo, they roll him tightly into a carpet and have their horses trample him to death. I cannot help but notice the tragic symmetry here.
It's hard to miss.
The Abbasid dynasty began in 750 by trampling the Umayyad princes with horses at a banquet to secure their power. 500 years later, their final ruling caliph in Baghdad is executed by being trampled under Mongol horses.
It is a profound historical rhyme. But if we synthesize the structural causes of this fall, we see that the Mongols did not destroy a thriving, unified empire. They merely kicked in a door that had been rotting from the inside for 3 centuries.
Right.
The over-reliance on mercenary slave armies alienated the populace, and the fatal decentralization caused by the 8-caste system completely destroyed the state's tax base and military cohesion.
The Abbasid Empire fell in 1258, but had engineered the mechanics of its own demise long before Hulagu Khan ever crossed the horizon. But incredibly, the Abbasid bloodline does not end under those horses. We have to talk about the final, bizarre chapter of this dynasty, the Shadow Caliphate.
Yes, the aftermath in Cairo. It is a fascinating postscript.
3 years after the sack of Baghdad, in 1261, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who rules over a powerful state in Egypt and Syria, tracks down a surviving Abbasid relative who escaped the Mongol slaughter.
Baybars installs him in Cairo as the new caliph.
And for the next 256 years, a succession of 18 Abbasid caliphs live in Cairo. But they are pure figureheads. They have 0 army, 0 treasury, 0 political power, and 0 say in state affairs.
They exist solely to sign documents granting formal investiture to legitimize the rule of the Mamluk sultans until the Ottomans finally conquer Egypt in 1517 and claim the title for themselves.
It is a striking conclusion for a family that once dictated global trade, commanded massive armies, and funded the greatest scientific minds of their era, to be reduced to a signature on a piece of paper.
So if we look at the complete arc, from the violent revolutionary overthrow of the Umayyads in 750, rising to the staggering intellectual and architectural heights of Baghdad's Golden Age, managing a complex melting pot of cultures, and then suffering a slow, agonizing fragmentation driven by mercenary armies and economic rot, culminating in the brutal Mongol sack of 1258, it's a massive story.
It is the absolute life cycle of an empire. It vividly illustrates how the very mechanisms designed to preserve power and efficiency, like the Mamluk army intended for absolute loyalty and the Ikuda system intended for administrative ease, can slowly become the fatal agents of a state's destruction.
It really leaves you with a lingering thought, especially when considering those final 2.5 centuries in Cairo. The mighty, heavily armed Mamluk sultans had absolute physical control over Egypt and Syria. They defeated the Crusaders and halted the Mongols.
Yet, despite all that military might, they still felt they desperately needed these powerless, captive Abbasid caliphs to sign pieces of paper to legitimize their rule. It makes you wonder, is power truly derived from military might and physical force, or is military might ultimately useless without the abstract, symbolic story of legitimacy to back it up? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.